This hearing will come to order, and I'm going to ask the members to come down to the committee and take their seats as we get started. This hearing is on international wildlife trafficking, threats to conservation, threats to security, and I would just start with the observation that we have a major slaughter going on across the African subcontinent. If we had looked at the numbers a few years ago, we would have found that between 1990 and 2005, South Africa lost 14 rhinos killed a year. Friends, last year there were 1,000 slaughtered in South Africa. It gives you a sense of the magnitude of what is happening to the white rhino, the black rhino. If we look at elephants, last year, back in 2011, 17,000 elephants killed in sub-Saharan Africa illegally. Now we go to the following year, 30,000 killed in 1 year. How can this be? How can this new battlefield in this fight end up in such an absolute slaughter, threatening the extinction of some of these species? There is a battlefield there, and part of it is with organized crime. And part of it is that organized crime have tools that poachers in the past did not have. And increasingly, rebel groups, and especially terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab, are carrying into the fight a new type of weaponry that these animals have not been up against in the past. And the battle where this is being carried out is on South Africa's national parks. Some years ago, some of us worked to set up a national park system, the Congo Basin Forest Partnership Act. Well, now those parks across Africa are the battlefield in which these species are being slaughtered. So, as one witness will tell the committee, we are at a pivotal moment in the conservation movement with an alarming, unprecedented, dramatic increase in the slaughter of wildlife. Driving that slaughter, of course, is the value, and I talked a little bit here about what happened to the black rhino. The value of rhino horn right now is $60,000 per kilo. Now, that's more than platinum, that's more than cocaine, so you can see why these criminal syndicates are part of the chain. You can have terrorists or poachers or some of these rebel groups that do the work on the ground, but they pass it off to a criminal syndicate that then moves it to market. If you looked at the cost of ivory, tusk, $1,000 per kilogram. So that makes trafficking among the most lucrative criminal activities worldwide right now, generating $8 to $10 billion per year. And that cash flow allows today's poacher to buy something he hasn't had in the past. He's got at his disposal helicopters, high-powered weapons, night vision goggles. And then you take into account the intelligence community and what they're briefing us on. And they're saying that traffickers' use of sophisticated networks is now part of the program to move these products, and that this is not just a threat to wildlife anymore. Increasingly, they say, you have terrorist and rebel groups capitalizing on this trade, and that's a threat to national security. One example, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia. They've turned to the ivory trade for funding. Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army, when we talked a little bit in the past in these hearings about exploiting child soldiers, well, they're exploiting the region's most unique and limited natural resource to fund its brutal violence as well as exploiting children. In response to this crisis, I authored legislation last Congress to expand the State Department's rewards program to target transnational criminal syndicates. That has been done. The first issue, the first example of this is the Pablo Escobar of wildlife trafficking. Vice Kasovang has been caught. His number 2 man was caught in South Africa and just got 40 years. Ivory and rhino horn were among what was being shipped out of the country. In order to take a comprehensive look at this problem, the President established an interagency task force. As a starting point, the group developed and published the National Strategy for Combating Wildlife Trafficking. And we're going to assess that today. We're going to look forward to hearing that report. And uniquely, the task force also sought advice from an advisory council of outside experts. And this included David Barron of the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. David has worked with Congress for years on these critical issues. There are many others, including Africans, whose views must be heard on this subject. And as this strategy was being developed, several of us urged the administration to act boldly, to utilize the tools, the law enforcement tools right now that we currently use to dismantle other illicit transnational networks. I know of no reason why we can't make the same argument. And one thing is clear to me: whether dealing with global terrorist networks such as Hezbollah, or international arms dealers such as Victor Bout, or even tackling North Korea's illicit activities, when the U.S. government is focused, when the government is directed, it can deliver devastating blows to our enemies. We have seen that. We have seen them put people like Victor Bout behind bars. What's needed here is exactly that approach. And what we want to do is encourage the administration to do precisely that. And I'm sure our NGO groups want to see the same follow-through. So future generations will judge our response to this crisis. If we want a world still blessed with these magnificent species, we need creative action, we need very aggressive action, we need to work with source and transit and demand to confront the challenge. And as Director Ash will testify, the criminals have raised their game. We now must do the same. And I'll now turn to the ranking member for her opening comment, Karen Bass from Los Angeles.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for today's hearing and in general for your leadership on this issue. I know that many people here are aware of Mr. Royce's leadership on this issue for many years, but a few months ago I was attending a dinner and had an opportunity to hear his full history on this issue. So I want to thank you for your leadership over many, many years. I also want to thank our witnesses today for your great work and commitment to solving this international crisis. I'm encouraged by the worldwide movement and the administration's focus on this issue, and I look forward to continue to be involved in the implementation of the National Strategy for Combating Wildlife Trafficking. As I know we will hear more of and have heard some, international wildlife trafficking is not only a security and conservation issue, but it also undermines the stability and development of many African nations. Throughout the continent, recent spikes in poaching has caused instability by providing funds for illicit activities, spreading violence, and hurting the nation's ability to develop indigenous and local sources of revenue through wildlife tourism. I've seen firsthand the importance of wildlife tourism to local community development. A couple of years ago, I was on a Codel to Gabon and also to Botswana, and I met with members of communities alongside eco-oriented wildlife sites. Many of the people provided services for or worked at these eco sites. In Botswana, for example, I visited a village where the villagers had a contract with a firm in South Africa, and the South African company came and helped them develop a small but a high-end resort, tourism resort. And they were able to, one, employ all of the members of the village in terms of building the resort, but also people who came and visited the resort, after a few years, they were able to generate $500,000 in revenue for the village, which they then plowed back into the development of the village. And it gave me a whole new way to look at this issue. I know that if trafficking continues at the current rate, It will undercut success that has been made at this site and many others, and prevent other communities from developing their own strategies to use wildlife tourism in community development. So I look forward to your testimony today, and also to see more of what we can do to end this, but also to assist the various nations in their further development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. Any other members want to make an opening statement? Yes, Mr. Rohrabacher.
I'd like to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. And for those of you who don't know, it takes someone to make a decision on how we're going to allocate our time here. And I think your decision, Mr. Chairman, to hold a hearing on this subject demonstrates the scope as well as the depth of your worldview. And not all chairmen would have a hearing on this issue. And today we acknowledge the destruction of these majestic species in Africa, and we realize and we underscore that closing our eyes to this perhaps historic malady that we're facing in humankind today not only isn't just the obliteration of wild species in Africa, but also has important to our own security, which so often happens when we close our eyes to some evil that's going on. We end up not being able to close our eyes, as the chairman's pointed out. Terrorists and others now are using this very vehicle to handle their own affairs, to pay for their own affairs, which threaten the rest of the world and threaten all of us. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We'll go to Mr. Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I want to just take a moment to applaud your leadership on this issue, and to say that I was at the same dinner and I was profoundly moved learning of your very long history in this area, and I'm particularly delighted to also recognize the new but equally passionate leadership of our ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee, Congresswoman Bass, and look forward to what we can do as a committee and as a Congress to address this very important issue. And I thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by representatives from the Department of State, the Department of Interior, and the Department of Justice, who represent the three co-chairs of the Presidential Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. Prior to her appointment as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environment, Dr. Carrie Ann Jones worked in several capacities within the U.S. government, including positions in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and NIH. Dr. Daniel Ash serves as the 16th Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the nation's principal federal agency dedicated to the conservation of fish and wildlife and the conservation of their habitats. And earlier in his career, Mr. Ash was a staffer here on Capitol Hill, where he worked, of course, on conservation issues, and welcome back. As Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Environmental and Natural Resources Division, Mr. Robert Dreher is tasked with prosecuting these environmental crimes. And without objection, your full testimony would be put in the record. And if I might suggest, you might want to summarize. If you could hold it to 5 minutes, and members are going to have 5 days to submit any additional statements or questions that you might respond to, and any extraneous materials for the record that they might want to put into the record. So, Dr. Jones, if you could start, we appreciate your being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Bass and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here before you today with my colleagues to address the wildlife trafficking crisis. At the outset, I would like to extend my thanks to Chairman Royce and other members of Congress for focusing strong attention and action on this pernicious, multifaceted crisis. If this is left unchecked, we will be facing more serious threats to conservation, local economies, security, as well as health. This terrible problem has been recognized by Congress, by the NGO community around the world, by the private sector, and across the executive branch. The President's July 2013 executive order called for action, establishing an interagency task force and an advisory council. And earlier this month, as you mentioned, Chairman, the President released the National Strategy for Combating Wildlife Trafficking, which lays out a clear whole-of-government plan forward with 3 strategic priorities. These are strengthening domestic and global enforcement, reducing demand for illegally traded wildlife at home and abroad, and building international cooperation and public-private partnerships to combat illegal wildlife poaching and trade. The September 2013 White Paper on Wildlife Poaching from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence points out that the increasing demand and high profitability of illegal wildlife products has broadened the scope and scale of the problem, particularly in Africa. African countries are facing mounting security challenges where they are often outgunned by heavily armed criminal operations. Strengthening enforcement is a necessity, and we have taken some actions to begin to address this crisis. This past November, Secretary Kerry announced the first-ever reward for information leading to the dismantling of the Sai Savang Network, a transnational crime syndicate facilitating wildlife trafficking across Africa and Asia. Chairman Royce's efforts were instrumental in being able to put out this announcement for reward, and we thank you, Chairman. For the last decade, the Department has partnered with other U.S. agencies to stand up 5 regional wildlife enforcement networks. And our goal is to connect these regional networks and create a global network. Our foreign assistance will continue to strengthen policies and legislative frameworks to enhance investigative and law enforcement functions and to support regional cooperation among enforcement agencies. They will also work to develop capacities to prosecute and adjudicate crimes related to wildlife trafficking. However, to address wildlife trafficking, we must also address demand. We must reduce the market for these products. To do this, we intend to strengthen our efforts with international partners to communicate the negative impacts of this devastating trade on security, environment, local economies, and public health. For example, USAID's Asia Regional Response to Endangered Species Trafficking, or ARREST, the ARREST Project, has launched a series of demand reduction campaigns in Asia's 3 biggest wildlife market and transit countries, and a first Asia-wide smartphone application that will help counter illegal trade in wildlife. And of course, we will continue to work through our missions around the world to get the message out every way we can. The 3rd strategic priority recognizes that solutions to this challenging problem require partnerships. We continue to strengthen our diplomatic work to raise the profile of this issue. We are highlighting the issue in the G8, in Asia regional bodies, and at the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. We have secured the inclusion of language to address wildlife trafficking in 2 security resolutions adopted in January 2014, sanctioning African armed groups. At the recent London conference, 42 nations in the EU signed on to a declaration that the U.S. helped shape that includes the commitment to avoid the use of endangered species in government purchases and also calls for the continuation of the prohibition of a ban on ivory trade. We are working with key partners like Indonesia, where just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Kerry signed an MOU with a memorandum of understanding with Forest Minister Hassan that addresses wildlife and conservation. We are working with China. Law enforcement entities in China and the U.S. joined other countries, including 26 African and Asian nations, in a successful global investigative effort, Operation Cobra II. This was a follow-on to an earlier activity, Cobra I. Both have been very successful. Also, in the upcoming strategic and economic dialogue with China, we plan to again address wildlife trafficking and to push for concrete actions in terms of raising public awareness to reduce demand and strengthening law enforcement. Mr. Chairman, I would like to reiterate Secretary Kerry's continued commitment to tackling this very important illegal trade issue. We are committed to do more and work smarter with partners around the world to support wildlife range states, to maintain the integrity of their national borders, and to protect their iconic wildlife for future generations. Congress has shown great leadership on this issue. We appreciate your support, and we very much look forward to working with you, continuing to work with you on this important issue. Thank you for the invitation to be here today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Ash.
Good morning, Chairman Royce. Good morning, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Bass, committee members. On behalf of Secretary Sally Jewell, I appreciate the opportunity to testify here today about the national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking. Spurred by President Obama's executive order, the strategy begins the process of leveraging resources and expertise across the federal government to crack down on the poaching and trafficking that is devastating some of the world's most beloved animals. Evidence of that trafficking on display here on the tabletop before us. As recent events demonstrate, United States leadership is vital. Since we crushed the United States stockpile of seized illegal ivory in November, China and France have followed suit, and Hong Kong has also announced its intention to do so. At my right, in front of Dr. Jones, is a sample of the crushed ivory from our Denver event in November. In addition, this past year we concluded our most successful CITES conference ever, with 9 of the 10 U.S.-sponsored proposals gaining approval by member nations. The Department of the Interior and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will help lead the strategy's implementation with our colleagues in the Department of Justice and State, building on the foundation that has been laid through decades of international conservation and law enforcement work. We have a 4-tiered approach to combating wildlife trafficking with our international partners. First, we continue to work with international law enforcement agencies to disrupt and dismantle trafficking networks and arrest those responsible for the brutal slaughter of these magnificent creatures. We have a photo, I think, showing some 1,500 raw tusks that were recently seized in Togo, the largest seizure yet by a West African nation. Perhaps that'll be displayed in a moment. We provide critical financial and technical support for on-the-ground conservation efforts and to build the capacity of range states to protect wildlife and bring poachers and traffickers to justice. We work here in the United States and with our partners in Asia, Europe, and Latin America to reduce demand for wildlife products. And we continue working with CITES member nations to support sustainable trade and well-managed wildlife management programs that provide jobs and economic development opportunities in development range countries, as Ranking Member Bass was speaking to, thus reducing the allure of poaching and trafficking. And now highlighting some of the strategy's most significant actions, we are using the full extent of our existing legal authority to stop virtually all commercial trade in elephant ivory and rhino horn within the United States and across its borders. Just yesterday, I signed Fish and Wildlife Service Director Order 210, beginning the implementation of that effort. All commercial imports of African elephant ivory into the United States will be prohibited without exception. Nearly all commercial exports of elephant ivory will also be prohibited, with the exception of a very small, strictly defined class of antiques with verified documentation of their antiquity. Domestic commerce will be prohibited, again with the exception of documented antiques and other items clearly documented as legally imported prior to the protection of the species under CITES Appendix 1. The strategy also recommends the continued sale of the Save Vanishing Species semi-postal stamp. The public has purchased more than 25.5 million stamps, generating more than $2.5 million for conservation of elephants, rhinoceros, tigers, marine turtles, and great apes. I want to conclude by asking you to consider this moment in history. Mr. Rohrbacher referenced the leadership that's being demonstrated here. We have a chance here and now to take action to ensure that elephants, rhinos, and hundreds of other wild plant and animal species do not vanish from the wild. Because of the President's leadership, that of good colleagues and friends in other great institutions, and that of this great committee, we can dare to dream that our grandchildren will be able to see these iconic species, their heritage as global citizens, in their native habitat, in the wild. I look forward to working with your committee to help to make this dream a reality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Dreyer.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Let's try one more time on punching that button.
Okay,
There we go.
that seems to be working. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the work of the Department of Justice regarding wildlife trafficking. The Department of Justice has long been a leader in the fight against wildlife trafficking, and we are deeply engaged in the administration's efforts to combat wildlife trafficking and implement the national strategy. Earlier this month, Associate Attorney General Tony West led the U.S. delegation at the London Conference on Illegal Wildlife Trade, at which more than 40 countries agreed to a declaration on the need for international action to address this crisis. And the Department of Justice served as a co-chair along with my fellow co-chairs from the Department of State and the Department of the Interior, and worked closely with 14 other federal agencies to develop the national strategy. As the strategy recognizes, strong enforcement is critical to stopping those who kill and traffic in protected species. The Environmental Crimes section of the Department of Justice works with the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country and with our federal agency partners to enforce the Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act, as well as statutes prohibiting smuggling, criminal conspiracy, and related crimes. In our prosecutions, we are increasingly seeing the involvement of criminal organizations, including transnational criminal organizations, that may threaten the security interests of the United States and its allies. We're currently involved, for example, in prosecuting cases developed through Operation Crash, an ongoing multi-agency effort with very strong involvement of the investigative agents of the Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies, including Customs and Border Patrol, to detect and prosecute those engaged in the illegal killing of rhinoceros and the trafficking of rhinoceros horn. This initiative has resulted in multiple convictions, significant jail time, penalties, and forfeited assets. Recent Operation Crash cases involve organized criminal elements that speak to the scope and scale of this problem. In one such case, Zifai Li, a Chinese national, pled guilty this past December to organizing a conspiracy in which at least 30 raw rhinoceros horns and numerous objects made from rhino horn and elephant ivory, worth more than $4.5 million, were smuggled illegally from the United States to China. Li admitted that he was the boss of several antique dealers in the United States who helped him obtain and smuggle wildlife items, and that he supplied ivory to 3 illegal carving factories in China. In another case, Michael Slattery Jr., an Irish national, was recently sentenced to serve 14 months incarceration, as well as to pay a fine and forfeit proceeds from his illegal trade in rhinoceros horn. He admitted to illegal trafficking throughout the United States and is alleged to belong to an organized criminal group engaged in rhino horn trafficking. We have seen success in prosecuting those who illegally traffic in elephant ivory, including, for example, a defendant whose import-export businesses were fronts for smuggling into the United States products from endangered and protected wildlife species, including raw elephant ivory. Another ivory case concerned a 2-year criminal conspiracy in which 6 defendants pleaded guilty to illegally importing ivory through the New York's JFK airport. In our cases, we seek substantial penalties, including incarceration, appropriate for crimes of this magnitude. Strong enforcement in the United States is not enough, however, as the national strategy recognizes wildlife trafficking as a global problem that requires a global solution. For that reason, the Department of Justice has for many years worked closely with other federal agencies to help foreign governments build their capacity to develop and effectively enforce their own wildlife trafficking laws. Our efforts in this area include training our foreign counterparts on the legal, investigative, prosecutorial, and judicial aspects of enforcing wildlife laws. We seek to help our partners craft strong laws, strengthen their investigation and evidence-gathering capabilities, and improve their judicial and prosecutorial effectiveness. I've temporarily lost my place, but I am soon about to recover it.
Feel free to summarize.
Well, let me just say that we are very proud of our record of achievement in this area. The national strategy is a reminder that much more is needed. The strategy calls for federal coordination through a whole-of-government approach and is a strong basis for our continued movement forward. We will commit our efforts to the prosecution of wildlife criminals and treat it with the seriousness that these crimes warrant and deserve. We look forward to working with Congress to strengthen existing laws and to adopt new legislation to improve the tools available to address this challenge. We welcome the longstanding interest of the members of this committee and others in the House and Senate in addressing this crisis, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could go to Mr. Ash first with the observation, Director Ash, that Fish and Wildlife has begun to do with the embassies exactly what we've had the DEA or FBI do in the past, which is to say, you're starting to station, I guess in Thailand you've done this, we're trying in sub-Saharan Africa, I guess it's in the paperwork to get one of your agents in the embassy there. I wonder, and I think it's in Tanzania that you're focused on that. Is there anything Congress could do to help expedite that, get that in place, get those agents on the ground in the embassies?
I think, as you said, with the help of the State Department and USAID, we've had success. We'll have our first law enforcement agent stationed in Bangkok later this month. We're working with the State Department. Our goal through the end of this year is to have 2 agents in Africa, 2 agents in Asia, and 1 agent in Latin America. And I think that the most important thing for Congress, obviously, is to provide the financial support for that. We did receive an increase in the most recent appropriations bill. We would hope to receive additional funding in the coming year to provide further support for this effort and encouragement, of course, Mr. Chairman.
When we checked in on Tanzania, what was the holdup at State on that? Do you know offhand, or?
I do not know the particular holdup.
If there's anything we can do to expedite that.
Tanzania is actually what we're trying to do is station an expert in Tanzania that's not a law enforcement. At this point, Tanzania has not requested law enforcement assistance, so a little bit different situation in Tanzania.
Likewise, most of us have been out there to talk to the head of state and to the legislature. I know Karen Bass makes frequent trips to that area, so if there's anything we can do with their legislature or their executive branch to elicit that request, especially given what's being looted out of, trafficked out of Tanzania, we'd be happy to do that. I'm curious on another subject, since the Attorney General and the Secretary of State consult with the Treasury Secretary on the designation process, there's existing authority to go after transnational criminal organizations that could be used here, because the Treasury Department has the ability to sanction property, sanction assets of transnational criminal organizations. So how would the Department of Justice request to Congress to place wildlife trafficking as a predicate crime for money laundering, bolster the effort in to attack the financing aspect of this, if you feel that's important, and if you do, is it possible from the panel here that we might get legislative language to do exactly what DOJ suggests here? Can you get me that draft language?
Mr. Chairman, we welcome your interest in this, and we would be happy to work very closely with the committee to try to develop language. The national strategy does ask for help from Congress. We are seeking to have the same law enforcement tools that we have available to us to combat other very serious forms of transnational crime. And for wildlife trafficking, some of those tools are more limited than we would benefit from, including in particular making wildlife trafficking a predicate offense for money laundering charges. We would also seek help in getting clarification of our authority for asset forfeiture in cases where the predicate offenses were wildlife trafficking. We really want to try to take the profit out of this crime. But, Mr. Chairman, we would be happy to work with the committee and as closely as we can.
That language would be very helpful and very welcomed, I think, by the committee, and we'd work to work that out and move it quickly. Local community-based conservation was the other aspect of this that I wanted to ask you about. When I was chair of the Africa Subcommittee, one of the trips we took with Secretary Colin Powell was to Central Africa. We spent time there with Michael Fay. National Geographic Explorer in residence, who explained to us the critical importance of supporting on-the-ground local actors who are on the front lines of this fight, who have a stake in the fight, and realizing the impact that local community engagement could bring to conservation. We went forward and authored the Congo Basin Forest Partnership Act. Now, with our wildlife trafficking crisis, what unique role does community-based conservation play, and what is their potential here for reducing wildlife poaching, and how could we better work with these local community groups who now have a stakeholder, right, in through their sustainable development practices of basically monitoring the population there, the elephant populations and so forth. How might we be able to work with those community-based organizations? Director Ash?
Again, I think working collaboratively is the key to that, and that's this the power in this all-of-government approach. Certainly, we have had within the Fish and Wildlife Service, within our international affairs program, we have for decades now focused on building capacity within range state nations, and I think that's what we have to do, and we have to build a local incentive for the conservation of these species, and the State Department has been a great partner in that effort. Again, it's resource limited. We have great NGO partners, many of whom will be stepping up their efforts as well. But I think what you referenced, Mr. Chairman, is the key, that we have to work at the community level. We have to build capacity, law enforcement, economic development capacity related to these issues. We can't do that. Any one of us cannot do that alone. We have to do that together. We have to have many, many more resources to get the job done.
The last issue I was going to ask your collective support for is an aspect that wasn't mentioned in the strategy, and that's the role of the Defense Department. Many of the park rangers in these African countries don't have the capacity to fend off poachers because they're outgunned, and many of these African countries depend on their militaries, frankly. They use the military there to protect the wildlife and to protect the borders. So the DoD has a long relationship with some of these armed forces. Leveraging those relationships by having them provide the training to these military forces or advising them could be very, very helpful in combating poaching. But I can tell you, there's been a lot of pushback from the DoD in the past when I've talked to them about this, or we've surfaced this issue. I think it would be very helpful if the three of you would sort of expand this strategy to include that component, because if we're serious about preparing these park rangers, they're going to need a little bit more help than just what we're talking about here. You're going to have to bump it up, and I think you're going to find that the DoD has provided technical assistance to African armed forces. It would just be changing the attitudes in DoD to get them to understand that this is part of subverting transnational crime and some of these terrorist groups and others who are benefiting out of this by cooperating. What do you think about that, Director Ash? What do the three of you think that's possible?
I think, again, the opportunity for increased intelligence capacity, increased information sharing, training on the ground can certainly be enhanced by the involvement of the U.S. Defense Department. I would say, Mr. Chairman, I think one of the tragedies in all of this is, if you'll recall, about 18 months ago, we lost a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park in an unfortunate incident, and caused a moment of, certainly within the entire Department of the Interior, and I think within the nation as a whole, a moment of grief. Well, we see, at one national park, Virunga National Park in the Congo, over the last decade, they have lost 100 rangers trying to protect these animals. So we need to better equip and train them, and we need to provide mechanisms of support for their families, because when those rangers are lost, that is a family income, a family that is essentially put at risk. And so we need better tools to deal with that aspect of this.
Well, what I'm trying to get you to focus on is if the DOD is going to provide technical assistance to African armed forces, if you expand this to the park rangers and get them that capacity, right now they're outgunned. So I think you need to convey that and see if you can't get us a little bit. If we can get the administration to support that, frankly, that would be very helpful, because we just went through a round here late last year on this. And so that's, I guess, what I'm asking you to do. Dr. Jones, if you could convey that and
Yes.
try to, the three of you rally around that, I think it'd be helpful.
If I may, Chairman, one of the strengths, I think it was, is this on now? One of the strengths of the approach that we have in the task force is that DOD is a member of this task force, and we have been in discussions with DOD and with AFRICOM. And
Right.
And
right.
we will continue those, and
there's no mention of the strategy or a role for the Defense Department in this document. That's why I'm pushing you. I'm saying we got pushback last year. I'm just saying, if they're outgunned, you know, you've got some people out there that can give them that capacity and the intel and sort of level the playing field. We want you to really push on that. My time's expired, and I'm going to go to Karen Bass. Thank you very much.
I just want to follow up on that, because I know in the discussions that I've had with AFRICOM while traveling and with DOD, there just didn't seem to be a real high priority. So I would definitely appreciate that message being sent. Along with that, you know, I also think of equipment that we might be able to be helpful with. I know in one country we talked about the use of drones. In Gabon, for example, that wouldn't work because of the rainforest, but in other countries, you know, it might be a very appropriate use. I wanted to ask some questions following up from the conversation that we were having before the hearing started about the U.S. in terms of the, you mentioned before how most of the ivory is passing through, but then there are also consumers in the U.S. I, prior to this, didn't really view our country as a problem. I thought it was more overseas. And so I wanted to know your opinion about what we should do here in terms of current law, increasing penalties, deterrence, et cetera. What are your ideas that we should do here?
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. I think the first step is to end commercial trade in the United States. So, as you mentioned, you know, in Los Angeles, you can visit probably dozens of antique stores. You can do that here in Washington, D.C., New York City, Seattle, any major U.S. city. You can go into an antique store and see items like this for sale. It's very difficult from a law enforcement perspective to tell the difference and tell that this is an antique, it's a 100 years old, something else is not. And so we need to end the trade. And so that's one step we can take.
You know, actually the stores that I was mentioning are not antique stores.
Right. They're just bazaar. You can go to the Dulles Bazaar, the monthly bazaar out here at Dulles Airport, and there will be probably a dozen, you know, stalls where people are selling ivory products.
It's kind of hard to say if you have 100 items that are exactly the same that they're antiques.
And so what we've found is the legal trade in ivory has become a smokescreen effectively for a burgeoning new trade, because the value of these products is so high and has escalated so dramatically. So we need to take that step, and it's not just important from the standpoint of ending the trade, it's important from the standpoint of establishing U.S. leadership on this issue. So the next big step is to use diplomacy on the global level to reduce demand. And that's long-term, that is the most important ingredient. And the U.S. has to be able to speak from a position of leadership. And I believe our ban on ivory trade in the U.S. sets an example for the world, as our crush of ivory did back in November. It allows us a position of leadership in the world and a voice of leadership.
Any other comments? Thank you.
No, I think that Director Ash's point about the leadership is one that we have a real opportunity to move forward on now. Just a short while ago, the Prime Minister of Vietnam went out to all of his ministries and said, you need to now pay more attention to wildlife trafficking. Very similar to what we did what President Obama did with his executive order. And Secretary Kerry had raised this with the Prime Minister during a visit and had talked about this issue. So I think that our ability to sort of have a full court press in all of our diplomatic engagements and being very credible about what we're doing at home, and also talking about how we can work together, will begin to bring down both the supply and demand. But our challenge now is to maintain momentum, and I think with this strategy and the implementation plan that will come from it, we will be able to do that.
You know, in thinking about my trip to Botswana and how they were able to, actually, the same villagers that understood that this was part of their economic development prior had been participating in poaching. And I'm just wondering if there is, you know, some role that the U.S. might play in either technical assistance, education, in other communities around the continent where you have people who are actually participating, you know, the residents and the community that lives nearby because they're desperate because of their poverty. They are seeing it from a very short-sighted perspective, and if that might be a role that the U.S. could play, is to go around and provide that technical assistance to show how this could actually improve your development and not view it so short-sightedly.
Well, I had the opportunity to travel to Tanzania, where I visited some of the USAID programs that try to do that.
Okay.
They have programs called wildlife management areas, where a community actually looks at the economics of being able to have tourism in their area. And it's a jointly owned process. I sat in a room where they looked at income from tourists coming in, and there was a real sense of what the value of the wildlife and their whole environment was to that community. And so there's a long history of doing that, and I think there are more examples of that spreading in different countries through different activities of USAID. Connecting that then to national policies, which have more protection and also have better national policies, will, I think, make a big difference, from local all the way up to the national.
And I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, just quickly, what about the African Union? Do you think the African Union is aggressively taking this issue on? Are we working with them?
Yes, we are working with them. We have raised it with them, and we continue to raise it with them. I would think that it's something that they have responded to. My former boss, Undersecretary Hormats, raised it with the leader of the African Union, and we will continue to do that. I think our approach has been, from a diplomatic standpoint, to work at this bilaterally, regionally, through international organizations, through every channel we can, and so that's the approach we're going to keep at.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rohrbacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Couple of just look at some specific suggestions, and Mr. Attorney General or Assistant Attorney General, would I think you mentioned asset forfeiture, and could we have today, if the assets are seized from these people who are breaking the law and are poaching and are being destructive of this natural resource, does that then go into the fund for preserving them and enforcing the law, or does the asset forfeiture just go into a general law enforcement fund?
There is some opportunity to direct funds that are seized or assets that are seized into law enforcement funds that can have some benefit for us. The Endangered Species Act, for example, has a fund program that lets us use it for some limited purposes. There isn't an ability to really direct the assets that are seized directly to law enforcement in a larger way. It's a very limited opportunity. And in many cases, when we seize assets under other statutes, when we, for example, are charging crimes involving smuggling, the assets will go directly to the Treasury and not to law enforcement activity.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that perhaps a source of revenue for this effort would be that we direct the assets that are seized from people who are breaking the law by murdering these species, that be directed specifically to that fight. That might increase the capabilities of those who are enforcing the law. In terms of technology, is there, we have incredible intelligence technology today. We can zero in and do these countries that are trying to oversee large areas where you have poachers active in there murdering these elephants and rhinoceroses, do they have the capability, do they have technological capability that would be affordable to them to get that job done? Whichever, Mr. Ash.
I would say across the board, Congressman, no. I mean, as Chairman Royce indicated in his opening statement, that what we have seen because of the escalation in value and demand for these products, the criminal networks have upped their game. And we used to deal with poaching, which is much like we deal with poaching in the United States. It was opportunistic. It was locally driven by local economies. We now see organized, syndicated trafficking networks, and they're very sophisticated. They have access to technology and arms and equipment that our colleagues in these range states do not have.
So in terms of overseeing a large animal reserve in Africa, we have people who are at a great disadvantage because they do not have what perhaps an infantry squad in Afghanistan would have.
Correct.
Available to them. All right. That is, we have a lot of, Mr. Chairman, we have a lot of excess military equipment that left over from these adventures in the Gulf that might be available to these people at a very low cost because we have it there. And who would, Secretary Jones, what countries would you give gold medals to, and what countries would you put on the dirty guys list?
That's a very good question. What I have been seeing in my travels is that the governments, many of the governments are trying to do the right things, and much of the poaching and the activity is coming from groups that cross borders. Mm-hmm. I think that a country like Tanzania is trying very hard to do the right things. I think that South Africa is trying. I think Kenya is trying. I know that there's been an effort with the legislators in Kenya to look at policies. So in terms of engagement in our discussions, we are seeing a lot of leaning into the right policy directions. Yeah. It's the implementation question.
I'm going to put you on the spot because what happens quite often, I always ask the question is, what are your most highest priority for budget issues, what's your lowest priority? And everybody's always willing to give their high priorities, but they're never willing to tell us the low priority because they know that that's where we will cut. In terms of the question I just asked.
Mr. Rohrbecker, my lowest priority in the budget is defunding Obamacare.
Thank you. What, Madam Secretary, you gave us some good countries. Do you have any bad boy countries that we should put on our list of people who are not doing the adequate job and perhaps intentionally not, maybe through corruption or whatever? I noticed you didn't mention Zimbabwe or any country like that.
No, I don't have, I mean, honestly, I don't have a country I would put on that list, and it's from my perspective, it's not a budget issue. I mean.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about budget. I'm just saying who you're telling us we got to watch out for these guys because they're not like not doing a good job. They may be in cahoots with the bad guys versus you gave us a few lists there of people that deserve a gold medal and which one deserve the bad recommendation.
I don't think I can answer that question because I'm seriously.
Okay.
you know, I would turn to Director Ash to maybe say what he's seeing on the ground, but from a policy perspective, what I'm hearing is that the governments are trying to take the right action. So I would turn to Director Ash, and maybe he's going to say on the ground.
Congressman, I guess I would say the most important thing right now is we have the opportunity to learn that. I think what we are finding is that because of the value of these products, they are finding the path of least resistance. And oftentimes that is not the range state. The range state is taking.
I see.
Okay. So I think the important thing is for us to learn the answer to your question. I think right now we don't know that it looks like the bad guy might be Zimbabwe, or it might be Congo, or it might be, but really they may be doing everything they can do within their power. So I think we need to learn that.
Well, I know if we're talking about fish and sharks that the Chinese like to have their old shark fin soup, and they are destroying. We used to, when I was a kid, I'm a surfer and all that. I used to spend a lot of time, and frankly, surfers and sharks don't get along. But I like to eat shark. I mean, we used to barbecue it. Yeah, they like to eat surfers too. But the fact is that the Chinese, with their consumption patterns, are destroying sharks, the whole shark population around the world, and that's an issue of concern. And Mr. Chairman, I would think that whether it's China or elsewhere, the consumers of these products, those governments need to be brought to task as well. Thank you very much.
And take shark fin soup off the menu. Let's go to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to pick up on Mr. Rohrbacher's questioning, because what he's getting at is the word efficacy. It is not, it seems to me, if we care about this subject, that it's not satisfactory that somebody is bending into the right policies, doing the best it can. The question is it effective? Are we losing this battle, or are we winning it? And what are the metrics that get us to winning? And Mr. Rohrbacher's question has to do with benchmarking. Where are the best practices? And bottom line, are they working? Otherwise, they're not best practices. So, Dr. Jones, let me reframe the question. As we look for models where there are clear metrics, where there's the commitment of the government, there are the resources in place, and in fact, we're seeing trafficking go down, and the organized traffickers moving on somewhere else because it's just too hard there, what would you cite? Where would you cite?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that question gets at the two parts of this problem, the supply and demand, because we've been talking about both market countries and range states. And certainly, the U.S. and China are two of the biggest markets for these products. Shark fin soup was also mentioned. And there have been campaigns that have shown that there has been an effect in reducing the demand for that by outreach. So we have been increasingly engaged with the Chinese to work on market demand, because the reason these prices are so high is because people will put out the money for this. So I would say that we do need benchmarks. We are at the turning point. I can't tell you exactly how much we have done with China to reduce demand of ivory right now, but I think what we need to do as we move into this implementation plan is look at how is the outreach going to affect demand, how are we going to increase seizures, how many more rangers are we going to have on the ground, and how many national policies do we have? So it's from the ground up to the policy that we have to have benchmarks, and we're just have the strategy out, and we're going to get to that with the implementation plan. But to make the point that it's both pieces of this, it's the supply, demand, and transit. And so we have to have benchmarks for each piece of that, and that's what we're working toward.
Dr. Jones, I appreciate that commitment, but this problem is not a new problem. One could infer from what you just said that we're pretty far behind the curve here in, we don't even have an implementation strategy to set benchmarks or metrics. We're just getting around to that?
Well, we're just getting to an implementation plan based on this recent strategy.
Is there a single country of origin, hold in advance China or the United States as consumer countries, But is there a single country of origin you can point to where substantial progress has been achieved, where poaching is down and animal populations are either stabilized or, in fact, growing?
Mr. Connolly, I would suggest Namibia. Namibia
Namibia.
is an excellent example of a country that has an exceptional program and record. There are 5,000 black rhinoceros left in the world. 1,800 of those are in Namibia.
We might not want to bring too much attention to that.
Right, yeah, that's right. And so what we owe those countries is support. So for instance,
Yes.
I mean, Namibia right now is, going through a process of allowing the harvest of a black rhino. They have a quota of up to 5 per year. They have never filled their entire quota. And right now it's become very controversial because they're going to allow the harvest of a single black rhino. But we owe them support because they are the gold standard. And so I would suggest Namibia, and so that we can expand that example throughout Africa.
And I think you've just put your foot on, your finger on something that I think is really important. Look, we've got to be bottom line focused here, including the State Department. Are we making progress or are we falling behind? You can have the best strategy, best policy, the best aspirations in the world and still lose the game. And where we find a good actor who's not only trying to do the right thing, but actually making progress, I agree with you, then let's get behind them big time to show others the reward system that faces them if they start to put the resources in to try to fight back against the poachers and the traffickers. Because I have to say, Mr. Chairman, I'm alarmed at what I'm hearing in this hearing. Not lack of effort, not lack of commitment, but we're losing this game. We are not making progress, and we're up against actually something far more organized, far better financed, far more violent and dangerous on the ground than most of the local governments or even military can frankly handle. And we're going to have to think through our strategy here and make it a lot more robust if we're going to begin to turn the tide. Otherwise, we're going to lose this battle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Connolly, I think you're right. I mean, on a lot of fronts, we are losing. In Namibia, we are winning, or Namibia, I should say, is winning, and part of that is because they have a community-based local conservation program of the first rank there, and it's something of a template.
Yes.
And if that can be expanded, then on other fronts, I think the tide can be turned.
And Mr. Chairman, just to underscore what you said, because you're putting your finger we've got to look at benchmarks. We've got to look at best practices and try to encourage them elsewhere. Otherwise, we can have a lot of international agreements and strategies and goals and policies, but meanwhile, we're losing the game.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Randy Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In reading through this report, it brings up a whole lot of questions, and I guess it does get to benchmarking and what my friend Mr. Connolly was saying, trying to get a benchmark and trying to make progress. So I've got some questions in our report, and this is not from y'all's testimony, but I do want y'all to answer the questions if you can. We talk about eyewitness accounts from the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, which talks about some of the abductees, for example, from Joseph Kony, has ordered his fighters to get elephant tusks, and they're going to terrorist groups. Are we building a database of the terrorist groups that are involved in this kind of trafficking?
Thank you for the question. We are closely following all of the activities and the different kind of illicit groups that are involved. So there are terrorist groups, there are militia groups, there are some just rogue military, and then you have that collection tied into organized and syndicated crime. And so, yes, we are certainly doing more to have information on some of these issues and to also work with our partners to get more information. So, yes, we are trying to move forward on that.
Okay, are we communicating those terrorist groups to our military forces, those who are responsible for the war on terror?
We are sharing our information with the appropriate players.
Okay, and have they taken any action that you know of against these groups based on the information that you've sent them, Dr. Jones?
I can't speak to that at this time here.
You do know, but this is not the appropriate setting?
Yes.
Okay, then we'll talk offline. And then, keeping in line with that questioning, of those terrorist groups that we're identifying with the database, are we rating and ranking them in what order, the most active and the second most active?
It's difficult to talk about all the details in this setting. There's a lot of information we are trying to gather and also share that with partners and other players, and we're continuing to sort of raise the importance of this issue as how it ties into all of these networks and their activities.
Okay, because we're talking about funding, but in the war on terror,
Right.
you know, once we've identified these groups, and you even, in our report, it talks about seems to be certain routes that they use in smuggling across the different countries. You talked about them traversing country lines, state lines, borders. Have we identified those routes? Are we, you know, staking out those routes?
We are beginning to track those routes, and we are beginning to sort of use that information in how we respond and share it with partners in sort of the coordinated operations that I was mentioning in my testimony, these different sharing of information between all of the countries involved in Africa and Asia to understand those routes. So I think we're in the process of getting more information on how all of these different illicit activities are coming around this activity, because this is about money. And so we're tracking the money. We have to follow the money, and that's one of the things we are really working on from both.
Okay, that's a great segue to my next question about the money, because we've instituted a rewards program. How successful has that been? Is it paying out, or how successful has that been?
Well, we have just started that as the legislation expanded that reward system to include wildlife crime. So it's just in November that we have announced the first reward, and I haven't gotten any feedback on that yet, but I can get more and get back to you.
Okay. And then you mentioned Namibia, I think, as being a success story. On the scale of countries and on the scale of the amount of trafficking, where do they fall? Are they number 2? Are they number 22?
I would put them at the top of the scale.
Well, no, that's in success.
Right.
But in terms of volume.
Volume of trade. Well, they have little trade. So from the standpoint of risk, they are low on the scale. So they have a very effective management and customs control regime. So
Okay, and then last question, I'm running out of time. So, I mean, I don't mean to disrespect them or the assessment that they're a success story, but if they have little traffic, if they're a small country and they didn't have a whole lot to fight, then it would have been easier for them to be able to fight that. Are we rating countries, governments, on how they respond to this problem? Some of them are cooperating, some are not. Are we rating those governments?
We have not to date. I think that's the point. And go back to a statement Mr. Connolly made that, you know, this has been going on for a long time. I guess I would say it has not. I mean, what we have seen in the last 24 months is a dramatic escalation, 7,000% rise in the value of rhinoceros horn. And so what we have seen in just the last 24 months is that these things have become so lucrative that these syndicated networks have rushed in. And so we're just learning about that. And so the routes of trade, for instance, what our traditional approach to dealing with wildlife poaching is you go after the poachers, you get the poachers. And so what we now need to do is we need to let these things move so that we can discover the routes of trade and who's making the money and where they are. And so we're just beginning, and the questions you're asking are the right questions, and we need to do that. We need to identify which countries are the risk, both the source countries, the transit countries, and then the demand countries. Where are the highest risks, and how can we stack and attack those?
Maybe, Mr. Weber, maybe I could answer some of that, because in the case of Al-Shabaab, to go right to your question, in September of 2013, Al-Shabaab, of course, attacked the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi. 67 people were killed there, and 200 people were wounded. And shortly after that attack, Kenyan President Kenyatta identified illegal trade in ivory as a source of funding for the terrorist group. And President Kenyatta made it very clear, and I think this was in the Wall Street Journal, where I read this, where he said, Al-Shabaab acts as a facilitator and broker, in ivory. One of the reports we have show that Al-Shabaab gets up to 40% of the funds necessary for its operating expenses through the ivory trade. The calculation of the quantity on the black market is up to 600,000 monthly. So when a terrorist organization like that is looking for hard currency and they're demonstrably involved in this activity, and the consequences of this is that they're able to sustain an operation in which they, create casualties to this extent. And as the President said, this cannot be curtailed without an offensive against overseas buyers. And he said, we need a global plan to end a business that endangers our wildlife and bankrolls attacks on our people in Kenya. That would be one example, but also from 2012, we had the situation with the Janjaweed, and many of us are monitoring what they've done, not just in Darfur, of course, and in Chad, but in the Central African Republic. But on March of 2012, the Janjaweed perpetrated one of the worst elephant slaughters in recent history anyway, riding over 600 miles from Sudan all the way to the national park in Cameroon. There they slaughtered more than 300 elephants, That is just the attack on Cameroon. They also attacked Chad. They also attacked several other countries. They went through Kenya on an attack. So you have these terrorist organizations that aren't just a threat to wildlife. I mean, they're carrying out ethnic cleansing, frankly, or carrying out military operations against those who they feel are their enemies. But one of their sources of hard currency is what they're doing in the rhino and ivory elephant trade. And
Thank you.
that's why I wanted to give you the specifics on that. But we go now to Grace Ming of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. As you know, China in recent months publicly destroyed large quantities of ivory, and sort of two-part question. The first part is I wanted to get your take on whether you think there has been enough action behind this great symbolism. And second, we talk about shark finning before. I've been a very small part of a national effort to eliminate the consumption of shark finning. We've been successful as of last year in New York State, not only via law enforcement methods, but also in terms of education and increasing cultural awareness. And I also would like to get your take on the cultural elements affecting the demand side here in the U.S. or abroad, and what are some strategies we can use to reach out to communities where demand for ivory is high.
Thank you. The Chinese did destroy about, I think it was 6 tons maybe of ivory recently, and we took that as a very good sign, but it is a sign, it is a symbolic sign of moving away from sort of a national support of this kind of trade. But more substantively, we have been working closely with the Chinese, and we have been seeing a strong interest on their part to partner with us on a number of ways of looking at this. So they have been very active, as I mentioned, in this international operation to look at all of the different points along the trade route, those COBRA operations, where COBRA 2 recently, I think, had something like an increase of 400 arrests and 350 seizures, and China was a partner in that activity. Now, that's in a multilateral setting, but we are also seeing, we've engaged the Chinese through the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which is one of our main bilateral engagements to discuss issues with them. And last year, for the first time, we discussed wildlife trafficking in this forum for our strategic relationship and our economic dialogue, which showed the importance of it. And it was a very engaged discussion, and we have been having very good follow-up on this. So there is engagement and there is interest. There is also, we have been working with the China-U.S. Joint Liaison Group on law enforcement, because there are all these different pieces of the problem that have to get attention. So clearly, China realizes that it's a large market for these products. We are also a large market, so we have been trying to assume a leadership together on this and engage in every way that we can. We have a lot of work to do, but I do think that there has been some progress, and I personally have been involved in the discussions. We also see it in our relationship on illegal logging, which is related to this issue. Now, the point about changing demand, we have been talking about that because there is a cultural issue. There's a younger generation coming up in our country and around the world that's very conservation-minded, and we are working with the Chinese about messaging. How do you get this out? That was a very important part of the whole shark fin campaign. So I think there's a lot we can do, and we are getting, as I said, a very positive response.
Ms. Meng, I would say one thing about the ivory crush and the elimination of confiscated stockpiles is that we have seen encouraging results initially. At last year's Conference of the Parties for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, there was agreement that all parties to the convention, 179 member nations, should report on their stockpiles, and that's due by the end of February. And so by the end of February, we'll have a sense of what our nation's carrying in terms of stockpiles. Like the U.S. stockpile, which we destroyed in November, was about 6 tons. A country like China would have many times that. And so having that information will then be able to put that in context, because it's not just the symbolism, it's the risk that those stockpiles represent, because they have to be secured. In the U.S., our stockpiles are very secure. In other European nations, they would be very secure, but in many of the range and demand countries, the security of those stockpiles is an issue.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go to Ted Yoho, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here today. And I never cease to be amazed at the stupidity, ignorance, and brutality and greed of my fellow man on something like this. I want to build on Ms. Ming's questioning on the cultural elements. You're seeing that change in the Asian countries where the big demand is. We can only hope that we do more of that. I assume you have videos of these animals slaughtered, the remnants of that. And I assume this goes through a regular business transaction. You have the supply side, which is the animal, and then you have the facilitator, the poacher, then the facilitator, the broker, and eventually the buyer. What is the poacher on an average? Is there an average figure that they receive out of this, and is there an economic incentive? We can say, don't do it. We'll give you the money.
I can sort of give you an estimate for one that I remember when we were discussing this with the Kenyans. I think the amount that the poacher was getting was like 5 times the annual salary of a ranger. It was some inordinate factor, but that may be off. I mean, Dan may have a better number on that.
I think in terms of the value, the end value of the product, they're getting very little. But in terms of the comparison to what they could otherwise make, they're making very much.
So they're making thousands.
By equivalent, yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the issue that the chairman mentioned, that community-based approaches to these challenges is very important, that the people see a value in an elephant tusk that's beyond the immediate harvest, because that represents a dead elephant, that represents a dead rhinoceros. So that's a one-time harvest.
Right, and that also represents a lifestyle for somebody for 2 or 3 years probably in those countries, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and they're looking at their family or lifestyle. The demand side, again, through education, it just it's mind-boggling that somebody thinks that, you know, they're going to get a hangover and they're going to crush up some rhino bone or horns and make a powder, and, you know, instead of just educating them a better way to deal with their problems instead of getting rid of our resources. And if you look at the lifespan of a rhinoceros, it's what, 45 to 60 years, and, you know, sexual maturity of the females, I think 6 to 8 years of age, and the males 10 to 12, and they've got about a year and a half of gestation period. Is anybody looking at, and I don't even know if I want to go here, but animal husbandry to raise them and then harvest the ivory? Because you were saying in Namibia that they allow for the harvesting of a male. I mean, are they using tranquilizers gun, or is it's shoot to kill, and then have your picture taken with it? I mean, are they looking at using tranquilizers and then removing the antler or the horn versus killing the animal?
There have been a lot of course, elephants, you can't remove the tusk. Any kind of ranching or farming of elephants is difficult because they're slowly reproducing, long-lived animals.
They sure are.
Rhinoceros, you can remove the horn from a rhinoceros. There has been some experimentation with doing that, but they grow back, and at the value of these horns, if you cut the horn off, low, even that little bit is extremely valuable. And so there have been attempts at what we would call traditional management approaches to this, and because of the value of the products, they've been largely unsuccessful. That doesn't mean we can't try in the future. The case I mentioned in Namibia is a sport harvest, so that's a post-reproductive male that is essentially outcompeting reproductive males. They need to take it out of the population for good management purposes. The individual who would harvest that has purchased the privilege to do that for, I think, close to $300,000. All of that money would go back into management. That's why Namibia has such an exemplary program.
Let me get your opinion on doing the ivory crush and breaking the supply side. Is that going to increase the value of them, obviously, and is that going to create more demand and a more black market? I guess you can't get any much more of a black market. Yeah.
The material that we crushed was confiscated, contraband, so it would never go into trade. So destroying it would have no.
But it decreases the supply side, so the demand or the value is going to go up on the stuff they can get, right?
No, because it would have never been in trade anyway.
But I'm talking about future procurement of the horns.
Presumably, but if you end the demand, if you end the trade and you end the demand, then that's the way I think we have to deal with it.
I agree. I mean, that would be the best way, and just get people off of this stuff. I just find it horrendous that people are doing this in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We go now to Mr. Matt Salmon of Arizona.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman. I think it goes without saying that we all support the idea of protecting and preserving and cultivating endangered species all around the globe, particularly elephants and rhinoceroses. This hearing is really helpful as we look toward the best models of how to access and address this program globally. Mr. Ash and Dreher, as you're working on new regulations on the domestic sale of ivory, I'm talking about ivory that's already legal and here, not the future stuff. I think it's important that we avoid the trap of unintended consequences. Specifically, I'd like to urge you to adopt rules that do not harm U.S. collectors. I mean people that already have it within the family. I'm particularly concerned about families that might have a family heirloom currently that is ivory, which could be a gun handle or a knife handle or a statue, which has been passed down from generation to generation with little regard to paperwork sometimes. And so I'm hoping that as we develop the rules, we don't get a situation where we're essentially taking family heirlooms and making them worthless. And so while I completely support going forward and making sure that, that folks that are acting in an illegal way, that we prosecute them to the nth degree of the law, and that we make sure that, you know, that we do this for the future. But how can we balance in rulemaking to make sure that people that have had legal ivory in their homes for years, from years and years and years, aren't hurt by the, you know, law of unintended consequences?
It's a difficult proposition, although I would say with unequivocally that people who have a family heirloom that has been passed from generation to generation can continue to pass that heirloom. They can own it. They can possess it. They can move it.
They can't sell it, though.
They cannot sell it.
And that to me, I mean, it renders the thing basically valueless.
If it's a family heirloom, it strikes me that the value is in the generational value of the product. If the challenge for us is that these products are, it's very difficult to judge the authenticity of them because of the value of them and the relatively low penalties associated with trafficking in them, that the risk is low, the value is high, and so legal trade is a significant smokescreen for effective law enforcement.
I understand that it might be difficult, but what I'm saying is not all family, I mean, it might have an heirloom. What if I have a Picasso that's left to me, but maybe my folks leave it to me and we come on economic hard times and we decide, you know, I need to sell that Picasso and because of the value of the product. I'm saying something that's been in the family for a long, long time. Is there a way to do rulemaking so that we prosecute the bad guys that are trying to exploit, you know, new ivory, and exactly what you're trying to accomplish? Your goal is not to punish people that have owned legal ivory for the last 100 years. Right. Your goal is to make sure that for the future that we don't have bad actors and further, you know, dealing with causing extinction or you know, a dwindling of those resources. So is there a way to develop the rules so that people that have had legal ivory don't get caught in the crosshairs?
I think there is a statutory exemption in the Endangered Species Act for antiques over 100 years of age, and but what we will have to do is ask for rigorous documentation. Now, if you own something that is extraordinarily valuable, like a Picasso or a, you know, a Steinway, or you're going to have that documentation because you will be able to show a trail of transaction over many periods because they're extremely valuable. And so I think that people will be able to document that for things that have extraordinary value.
What if I owned a firearm that had ivory grips on it and perfectly legal, but I sold the firearm? Am I going to be in the crosshairs of the government because I'm selling something that I've owned for several years, but I've decided I want to sell it?
Well, I guess I would, from the standpoint of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our priority for law enforcement is syndicated commercial scale trafficking. Okay. We're not looking for the average American, although it would, under our proposed ban, if that firearm is not an antique, then it would be illegal for you to sell it, and you would need to be aware of that. So I think that's it is our opinion that we do need to end the legal commerce in ivory, and we need to do that at some point in time.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ted Poe, Judge Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I'm very concerned, like a lot of folks are, about this, actually the disappearance of some of the world's animals because of these outlaws that are killing them and selling them for money. It's all about that filthy lucre money, and it involves a lot of bad guys, terrorists, criminal gangs, you know, solo thieves and bandits, but it's all about the money. And I'm really concerned that they may be actually eliminating a species, that they're successful, so successful that they're not breeding enough of these animals to catch up with the robbers of their lives. Lacey Act, I want to talk about that. Hypothetical question, and really I'm looking for some answers on what we can do, Congress, to go nail these people. Maybe that's not polite language, certainly not diplomatic language, but anyway, we got a company, let's use a hypothetical, operating in Africa. And they're a conservation company, and they trade in endangered animals. They violate the Lacey Law. If they're an American company, they're subject to the Lacey Law in the United States. Is that correct? American company, they're violating the Lacey Law, operating in some African country, and they could be prosecuted under the Lacey Law. Is that correct?
I think the predicate offense in a Lacey Act violation is putting into commerce or importing into the United States an article that is taken in violation of foreign law.
That's assumed.
So they'd have to be bringing it into the United States.
They're bringing it to America.
And if they're doing that in violation of the host country's wildlife laws, yes, that would be a Lacey Act
Go
violation.
after them. Nail them. But you got a foreign country doing exactly the same thing in the fact that they recruit. They're in violation of the Lacey Law in other areas. But let's say they advertise in the United States. They recruit hunters to go to their little game ranch, wherever it is in Africa, but they're notorious for operating and trading in illegal, ivory or whatever it is. But they still are able to get access to American hunters and advertising because the Lacey Law doesn't apply to them. Is that correct?
Again, I think unless the American participants are bringing into the United States,
they're not doing that. They're not bringing it in.
They're not bringing back trophies.
No, but you got this corporation, foreign corporation, operating, doing the same thing, only they're operating in another country. The only thing they do in the United States is recruit hunters to go, and they, hunters go and don't bring the trophies back, the illegal trophies back in the country. My real question is, how can we get the Lacey Law or some type of action to go after these independent foreign corporations that are doing this and really competing with the good corporations in the United States that have vast amounts of land that they conserve, doing the right thing. But they compete with these guys that are involved in the trade. I don't know that I framed the question very well. What can we do to go after those folks, I guess is really my question. What can we do legally, legislatively? Ideas. I'm open to ideas, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind, Congressman. I think you raise a very good dimension of this. One is the typical diplomatic route. We work with these countries to show them how the Lacey Act works and sort of try to encourage them to have laws just like it. So we do try to do that. The second thing is in trade agreements, that we have environmental provisions that elevate this and try to ensure that countries involved in trade relations are dealing with issues like this and following international agreements like CITES. And that's part of the requirement in the trade agreement. And so we do have environmental sections of our trade agreements, and we are in the process of trying to put these into some of the new agreements that are under negotiation.
Can't we at least prohibit those companies? We know about what they're doing in another country. We can't reach them because they're a foreign company. Can we prevent them, since they're doing this activity, from at least advertising and recruiting in the United States?
If they are, I think, as Dr. Jones mentioned, we have other international instruments like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and if their activities are undermining the implementation of those other international instruments, then we can bring in action, we can sanction those countries under the Pelly Act, so we have we do have mechanisms to ensure that international instruments are being effectively implemented, they're not being undermined. And so perhaps we should look at the Pele Act, but I would applaud you, Congressman, for your reference to the Lacey Act. It is the workhorse of national and international wildlife law enforcement. And I would just, say to the committee, and tomorrow there's a hearing before another committee of this House of Representatives where some significant actions are being considered that will weaken our ability to enforce the Lacey Act. And so we need effective voices to not just maintain the Lacey Act, but strengthen the Lacey Act as a means of enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, thank you, Judge Poe. And again, we thank our three witnesses here. We especially want to thank also the NGO community that are really integral to, frankly, the partnership that's got to be put together here to bring the amount of attention necessary to elevate this issue before it's too late, as I indicated in my opening statement, before we reach the point where these species have been slaughtered to the point of extinction. So thank you all for your efforts here, and we will be back in touch because we do need that draft language, your assistance on that front, and thank you again to our witnesses. We stand adjourned.